Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Today's episode is on a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. It's a toe dip into content that I've been teaching for over 20 years now, and it's actually based on the very first group program that I ever led many, many, many years ago. More recently, over the last decade, I've also been teaching the topic that we're going to be looking at today as a coaching technique and methodology for practitioners. And it's one of my most popular trainings. But most importantly, what we're going to start to dip into today, I call it the sacred rhythms method, is wisdom that I've been living and really working toward embodying for decades, ever since I stepped into the world of women's circles and cyclical and earth-based living. I apply the wisdom that we're going to be looking at today, which in one way or another can also be found in nearly every religion and culture that has ever existed. I apply this wisdom to every area of my life, to every program that I create, to every marketing launch that I have. I apply this wisdom to every project I do in my business, from website redesign to hiring new team members. And I also apply this wisdom to my personal relationships, my parenting, my health habits, and all of the projects I do in my personal life and in my home. And I know without a doubt that so much of the success and satisfaction that I have been able to create in my life has been because of the sacred rhythms wisdom that we're going to be looking at today. Without sounding too dramatic, the sacred rhythms method truly has the power to change everything in your life and in your clients' lives, including your ability to create what you're meant to create, both in your personal life and in your professional life, as well as the way that you understand and approach life itself. So let's dive right in and let's start here. If you have a look at any cycle in nature, you're going to find that there are four phases in that cycle. There's a planting phase. That is a phase of starting the new cycle, of initiation, getting new things started. And then there is a growing phase. Once you've planted seeds, you've started the new thing, it grows, right? There's a phase of growing. After the growing phase, if you look at any cycle in nature, there's a harvesting phase. Time to pause, to reap what has been sown, to get the benefit of it, and then start transitioning to the next phase, which is the phase of releasing, letting go, dying. We see these four phases, like I said, in any cycle of nature. So if we take the wheel of the year, for example, the full year, we've got the four seasons that mirror the four phases. Spring is the planting phase. Summer is the growing phase. Autumn is the harvesting phase. And winter is the releasing and letting go phase. We can see these four phases in the cycle of a month. The new moon, the first quarter moon, the full moon, and the third quarter moon. We see these four phases in the cycle of a day. Sunrise, planting phase. High noon, growing phase. Sunset, harvesting phase. And then evening is that time of releasing and letting go. We even see these four phases in the cycle of life. Childhood can be seen as the planting phase of life, the starting new things, learning new things. And then young adulthood can be seen as, and mid adulthood as well, can be seen as the growing phase of life, time of productivity, time where we grow our relationships, our career, et cetera, et cetera. And then we can see that time after midlife, around the time of retirement, let's say, as that harvesting phase. We're enjoying the fruits of labor. We get pleasure from all of that productivity in life, etc. And then our elder years moving in towards death can be seen as the winter phase of a human life cycle, that time of starting to slow down, starting to release, etc. We even see these four phases in a woman's monthly cycle. In the menstruation cycle, the bleeding phase can be seen as the releasing phase. The follicular phase of a woman's monthly cycle, that's when the follicle stimulating hormone is active. That's when estrogen and testosterone begin to rise. That's like the spring phase or the planting phase. Ovulation is akin to that growing phase. And then the luteal phase of a woman's monthly cycle is the harvest, is the decline in the hormones. And so, as we kind of start to identify these four phases, the planting, the growing, the harvesting, and the releasing that are seen all throughout natural cycles, the sacred rhythms method is based on the understanding that just like everything in nature, including our life cycle as humans, goes in cycles, so do our projects, our businesses, our client relationships, our group programs, our personal relationships, our habits, so on and so forth. Every single one of these things has the four distinct phases. So every single one of the projects in our personal and professional lives and the relationships in our personal and professional lives has a planting phase. For example, every romantic relationship has a planting phase where the relationship is initiated. Maybe you meet online. Maybe that planting phase is that get to know you phase in the romantic relationship when you go on a first date or a first series of dates. Every business idea or program has a planting phase. That's when new ideas start to get visioned. During that planting phase is where you start to clarify what that idea is or what that new program is. It's when you start to set the foundation for the new idea or the program. You see how can you create time for this idea? How can you find funding or resources, etc. All of that is planting. Every helpful habit that you have in your life has a planting phase. For example, let's say you have a meditation practice. The planting phase of that meditation practice is when you decide that you're going to start the practice, where you learn more about that particular meditation practice, where you figure out how to make that practice work in your schedule, right? All of that is initiation, is planting. For me, an example in my own life is this podcast. When I started this podcast almost a year ago, it was in the planting phase for a while. Before I even recorded the first episode, I needed to take the time and space to come up with the main purpose of the podcast, to craft the title of the podcast, to get clear on what is it really going to be about and how do I want to show up in it. Part of planting seeds for this podcast was making sure I had time for it in my schedule, doing research on what makes for successful podcasts, hiring new team to help plant the seeds, set the foundation, so on and so forth. So that's planting in our projects. And just like everything in our lives, all those projects and relationships have a planting phase, they also all have growing phases. For example, the growing phase of a romantic relationship might be after the initial date or the initial month of dating, when you've decided that you like someone enough to start dating them more regularly. Then you're in the growth phase. And once you start dating regularly, you're firmly in the growth phase, the relationship functions and feels differently than those initial dates. You're doing something different in that growing phase in the relationship. It's a different phase. Here's another example. The growing phase of that meditation practice that I mentioned before, that might be after you've had a couple of sittings and you've decided, yes, I really want to commit to this meditation practice as a part of my life. So then the growth phase is you've committed and you start the work of sitting daily, of working at the practice, growing that practice, learning the nuances of the meditation practice, really devoting yourself to getting better and better at it, and maybe to spending more and more time on it. Right now, this podcast is in its growth phase. And it has been, I'd say, for at least the last 7, 8, 9 months. After that initial planting phase and getting the podcast launched and off the ground, I moved into a different phase with it. I'm now deeply committed to growing it. I'm doing the really hard but satisfying work of continuing to make space for it in my schedule, of working to get more and more skilled at choosing episode topics, at writing scripts. I'm working diligently at growing the interest in the podcast, the listenership in the podcast, etc., etc. It's a different feel and energy than when I first started it, when I was first trying it out, when I was first just getting used to it in that planting phase. Continuing to move through the phases, every project or relationship or habit or venture in our lives also has a harvest phase. So, for example, let's say you started a project of remodeling your kitchen. The planting or the initiation phase was making the decision to do the remodel, getting the design plan in place, maybe picking your tiles, hiring the contractor, etc. And then the growing phase of the kitchen remodel was the contractors coming to do the work each day, you shifting your life around each day to grow the project, to make space for the remodel, working on the issues or the inevitable problems that come up in a remodel, the delays, etc., making new decisions, etc., right? And then once the remodel is done, is complete, the harvest phase is when you get to celebrate that the work is done. You get to enjoy the kitchen. You get to take pleasure in it. And you also get to gather your lessons from that kitchen remodel experience so that you can apply those lessons to your next home project. That's another important part of the harvest is what have you learned? How can you assess? Another example of the harvest phase in our lives, back to that romantic relationship example we've been talking about. Maybe the harvest phase of a romantic relationship is when you celebrate a 1 year anniversary, right? You get to enjoy the fruits of your labor, of the growth by celebrating. Or maybe an example of a harvest phase in a romantic relationship is the decision to take the relationship to the next level, get engaged, get married. And then back to my podcast example, while there will still hopefully in the future be a lot of things to harvest and celebrate from this podcast in years to come, because I still do have a lot more growing of it. And I've got a lot more big goals around this podcast that I want to achieve. I've already moved through a mini harvest cycle with this podcast and many, many harvest cycles actually with this podcast. So, for example, when we got the first glowing reviews of the podcast, that was a harvest phase, a moment to celebrate, to take pleasure, to assess. Or when we hit 20,000 downloads, right, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, every single project or habit or relationship in our lives also has a release phase or a death phase, akin to that winter phase, if you will. So, as an example, um, sometimes the romantic relationship is going to come to an actual end, right? You've seen it through initiation, growth, harvest, and then it's done. So the end of a relationship can be an example of a release phase or a death phase in romantic relationships. But that being said, in long-term romantic relationships, there's many mini cycles of these four phases. So it can be the end of a certain cycle in the romantic relationship. For example, John, my husband, and I experienced a death phase or a release phase in our romantic relationship when we moved from being a couple without kids to being a couple that had children. We ended the childless phase, and then we started a new spring, a new initiation, a new planting in the parenting phase of our relationship. Or let's take, for example, that meditation practice that we've been talking about. Either at some point, the meditation practice isn't going to be for you anymore, and you will release it altogether, and that will be the release phase. Maybe it's not working anymore, it's not relevant anymore, etc. Or it might be that a certain cycle or era of the meditation practice gets released. For example, maybe you decide to shift how you're meditating, or the type of meditation, or the amount of time that you're sitting for, etc., right? So that would be the release phase, and then starting the new one with the new type of meditation, etc. Okay, so all of this might sound simple enough, and yet this isn't quite what all of the projects in our work and life look like, right? They don't look this perfect going through the four phases. We have trouble. We have trouble in the planting phase. In the planting phase, we may have trouble starting things correctly. We may have trouble setting the proper foundations for the project or the relationship. We may have trouble actually envisioning what is right for us. And instead, we end up creating a vision that's based on shoulds or have tos, right? So many obstacles in that planting phase, in that initiation phase. So, for example, in romantic relationships, when there's trouble in the planting phase, maybe you either don't work on fears around rejection, so you don't even end up putting yourself out there to meet someone, right? You don't even get to plant anything because your fears are holding you back. Or you maybe meet someone, you go on a first date, and then you quickly skip over the rest of the planting phase of the setting foundations, and you jump straight into exclusive dating or seeing each other all the time, but you jump too soon into that, and it's a mistake. Or here's another example of trouble in the planting phase. Let's go back to that meditation practice example. Maybe you barrel right into the meditation practice and you don't take the time to plant, to do the research to see which type of meditation might be best for you. Or maybe you jump in without letting your partner know that you need 10 minutes to yourself each morning and can they take care of the kids, right? And because of this, because you didn't quite do the planting phase correctly, it just never, the meditation practice never gets off the ground. Human beings also have trouble in the growing phase. Oh, so much trouble and obstacles in the growing phase. This can look like losing interest or stamina to grow your projects or relationships or to bring them to completion. Trouble in the growing phase can look like getting dejected because things don't work out or feel successful right away. And so you just give up instead of seeing the growing phase through. Um, Trouble in the growing phase can look like letting fear lead you through the growth phase. And so then you overwork, you spend too much time on the project, you get exhausted, you burn yourself out. So, for example, if we go back to our romantic relationship example, trouble in the growth phase might look like giving up once the relationship gets hard, or giving up once it's time to meet the parents, right? Not allowing the growth to happen. Or here's another example when it comes to marketing our work. And I see this happen for folks all the time when they go to market their work. You're in the growth phase and you put some attempts out to launch your program, let's say, and at first, those attempts don't yield the results that you want. And so instead of sticking with it, instead of seeing the marketing through, instead you just abandon ship and you give up the launch. And then maybe you rush to create the next business idea, follow the next shiny object. It takes work to stick with the growth phase, right? Think about, we said that summer is akin to the growth phase, think about that sun in the summertime that has to show up every day with patience to grow the plants, right? It takes work. So just like as humans, we have troubles with the planting phase and with the growing phase, we also have trouble in the harvesting phase. Obstacles in the harvesting phase look like having trouble celebrating our wins and our successes, and instead only seeing what didn't work or thinking that there's no harvest at all. Obstacles with the harvesting phase, and I am sometimes guilty of this, I'm working on this one, is just skipping over enjoying the fruits of your labor. You've worked so hard in that growth phase, and then instead of enjoying it, instead of acknowledging it, you just skip over and you're on to the next thing, right? You don't take that time to really enjoy. So, a specific example of trouble in the harvesting phase, let's look at that marketing launch again. I see this happening for a lot of people. Um, you do the work or some work to grow the marketing, and you don't get the results that you want. Maybe you don't sell anything or you don't sell as many spots in your program as you like. Even in this case, do not skip over the harvesting phase of this project. Do not skip over identifying what did work well. How did you grow? What progress and movement did you make? Even if it is now you understand what it takes to market a program and you didn't before, right? Or maybe there is something to celebrate around how you've grown, your ability to be seen, right? But you want to harvest, you want to celebrate what wins and successes there are. And also, you want to do assessing what worked, what didn't work, what can I do different next time? That is what is going to help you doing the harvesting phase, even when there is a perceived failure, is what is going to help you get to the next cycle, the next marketing launch, and to be more successful in it instead of either just giving up, deciding this isn't for me, I'm not doing this anymore, or just recreating the same mistakes that you did last time. And just like there is trouble in the harvesting phase, the growing phase, the planting phase, as human beings, we oftentimes have trouble in the releasing phase of our projects, of our relationship. And this can look like not knowing when to stop or let go, clinging on to a relationship longer than it should be, right? So not ending things when it's time for them to end, or not resting and taking a break when it's time to take a break, or trouble in the releasing phase can also sometimes look like destroying things in a way that isn't clean, where you burn bridges. So it's like you do the releasing, but you do it in a destructive way that doesn't serve you. Um, Specific examples of this is having trouble letting go of a certain type of ideal client that isn't right for you anymore. And it's like, you know that that kind of ideal client isn't right for you anymore, but if you have trouble in the releasing phase, you cling on. You don't shift your marketing and your outright reach. Or maybe you have been leading a program and it's really time for that program to either be retired, for you not to teach it anymore, or for you to do a major shift in the program format or the way that you're teaching it. But you're clinging on to the old. Another example is holding on to a relationship that just isn't working anymore. Um, so lots of different ways we have trouble in that releasing phase. Also, as I said, not taking a rest, right? So even with this podcast, I have plans to take a month off at a certain point. That is about releasing one phase, making time and space for a new phase, and also giving me a chance to rest. So, the idea with all of this, and I hope all of this is feeling resonant for you, my dear listener. The idea with all of this is to be able to deeply understand not only each of the four phases, but how to really embody and master each phase, how to harness the energy of each phase, how to overcome the obstacles and the fears that present themselves in each phase. For example, in order to really do planting well, so that you start important projects, habits, and relationships the right way, and so that you build them to last, you need to work with the fears of starting new things, right? You might have fears around it that starting new things might not work. Maybe you have fears around being a beginner, needing to know everything, et cetera, et cetera. In order to do planting really well, you may need to work on your curiosity. Curiosity is a big, important trait that you need to start something new, right? Just like children, who are in the planting phase of life, they are marked by curiosity. They are willing to open up and learn and see new things. That's how you're supposed to start life. That's how you're supposed to start new projects. In order to do planting really well, you need to work on taking the time to set foundations, or maybe on being willing to be wrong, right? That's another thing that kids are willing to be wrong because they know they don't know everything. And that's what helps set them up for success on new things. In order to really do the growing phase well, so that you show up to do the building work and you really grow what you want to grow in your life, you need to work on shiny object syndrome, for example, or you need to work on your own personal resilience, right? Continuing to be resilient, even when things don't work out at first the way that you wanted them to. In order to do the growing phase really well, you may need to work on your perfectionism or on your survival instincts that are at the root of your overworking habits, et cetera, et cetera. You may need to work on learning how to shine persistently like the sun does in summer, without burning yourself out. in order to do the harvesting phase really, really well so that you actually enjoy the fruits of your labor and you don't get stuck in a cycle because something hasn't worked. You need to learn how to feel worthy of acknowledgement and how to feel worthy of receiving goodness and taking it in. You may need to learn how to reframe failures so that you can see the learnings and the successes in them. You may need to learn how to allow yourself to pause and learn how to take pleasure in, etc., etc. In order to do releasing well so that you don't get left behind with outdated projects or relationships that don't work for you anymore, so that you don't cling on to the old, so that you don't hold yourself back from rest. You may need to work on getting comfortable with letting go and letting things die. You may need to work with your fears of being in the mystery and not knowing, right? Because that's another thing with releasing. We have to be willing to step into the unknown. We can't go straight to the next spring when we're about to go into winter. We have to go through some of that darkness of winter, of letting go. So all of this is big work and it's profound work. And it's work that touches every single area of our lives. And it's not just about being able to complete projects or have successful businesses or relationships. Of course, it is about that, but it is also about the level of satisfaction that we feel in our lives. It's about learning how to love and accept ourselves no matter what we've accomplished or not accomplished. It's about learning to move through our projects and our lives with flow versus always fighting our way through everything. This work is about getting proper rest and not burning ourselves out. It's about cultivating more connection and trust with the process of life itself. And this work, by the way, this sacred rhythms work, is also what is needed to save our planet and our Mother Earth. This is about sustainable growth, not about production and growth at all costs for ourselves. And then it ripple effects out into the earth. We need this as a people, individually and collectively. So it has really been my honor to share all of this with you today and to give you this brief introduction into the sacred rhythms method. I really, really hope that this has brought value and inspiration to you, even this little toe dip that we've done today. And I hope that it's starting to generate ideas for you too. I would love to hear what it's sparking for you. And I've created an entire coaching methodology based on everything that I've shared today. That coaching methodology addresses all of those fears and the obstacles that we spoke about that can be in the way of the 4 phases. That coaching methodology also makes use of archetype work and deep somatic transformational work. And I'm going to be teaching this entire coaching methodology later in February. It's called Sacred Rhythms. And I'll drop the link for the Sacred Rhythms training in the show notes for you. It's a quickie program. It's only 5 sessions, but it has so much depth and so much richness. And if you would like to take a smaller next step in all of this work, I invite you to register for the Alchemy Lab that's coming up on February 3rd. It is a 2-hour live workshop where we're going to be going even more in depth in everything that I shared with you today. I would love to see you there. I'll share the link for that in the show notes as well. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to listen and show up. I so appreciate you. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, let us know. Give us 5 stars. And please, please, please share it with any friends who you know would love it as well. Until next time.